Can we truly be the masters of our fate, or are we merely slaves to our circumstances? Today, a friend of mine will explain it to you.
Welcome to this explainer. Look, today we are not talking about Fyodor Dostoevsky as just some dusty, boring 19th century author you had to read in high school. No, we're looking at him as a dangerous, brilliant prophet. This guy perfectly diagnosed the anxieties of our modern, tech-obsessed world. So if you think his writings are just relics of the past, well, get ready to have your entire worldview challenged.
Let me ask you something. Are you just a piano key? Or, I don't know, a mathematical formula? It sounds totally absurd, right? But Dostoevsky saw that modern systems, actually very much like the 19th century utopians he was arguing against, absolutely love to treat human beings as if we're just predictable algorithms. It's a super comfortable assumption for people building systems of control. You know, the idea that if you just input the right data, human behavior will predictably output the perfect result every single time.
Okay, let's dive into Section 1, the myth of rationality. So, the mindset that really sparked Dostoevsky's greatest rebellion is what's known as rational egoism. It was heavily promoted by Russian thinkers back in the day, like Nikolai Chernyshevsky. And the whole idea is incredibly deterministic. It basically claims that if we just rely entirely on science and logic, well, humans are naturally going to act in their own best interests, and by extension, the best interests of society. They really believe science could build this flawless social utopia, what they called a crystal palace. Honestly, it sounds a whole lot like the modern promise that algorithms and big data are going to perfectly optimize our lives, doesn't it?
But Dostoevsky absolutely rejected this. That brings us to Section 2, the disease of consciousness.
To shatter this comfortable myth, he introduces this rebellious character known as the underground man, who makes this really famous, kind of shocking declaration. He says that to be acutely conscious is a disease, like an actual honest-to-goodness disease. And why would he say that? Because human beings actually deeply resent pure logic. We just aren't piano keys waiting to be played by a perfectly rational system. In fact, Dostoevsky argues that we will deliberately act stupidly, irrationally, or even completely destructively, literally just to prove that we have free will and aren't predetermined cogs in some machine. So we're left with this really stark choice. On one hand, we've got Chernyshevsky's rational utopianism. Now that promises peace and prosperity, sure, but it comes at the cost of our free will, right? We become utterly perfectly predictable. Then, on the other hand, there's Dostoevsky's irrational expressivism. It's chaotic, it absolutely involves suffering, but it is fiercely and undeniably free. He's essentially warning us that in a highly rational, hyper-controlled society, our freedom gets so distorted that behaving completely irrationally actually becomes the only way left to prove we even have a choice.
Let's move to Section 3, the price of utopia.
To really wrap our heads around the moral cost of these perfect systems, Dostoevsky drew on this striking philosophical question from the French writer Balzac. Think about this. If you could become incredibly wealthy just by pressing a button, but that button instantly kills an unknown mandarin in China, would you do it? It's a brilliant question because it jolts us right out of all those abstract mathematical theories and forces us into the messy, visceral reality of consequentialist ethics. You know, that age-old idea that the ends always justify the means.
And Dostoevsky takes this to its absolute limit in his masterpiece, The Brothers Karamazov, specifically through the character Ivan. Let's walk through Ivan's argument here, because it is dense but so important. Step 1. Imagine you are the architect of a perfectly peaceful human destiny. Step 2. You have to acknowledge that building this ultimate harmony requires the unavoidable torture of just one tiny, innocent child. Step 3, and this is the absolute crux of the whole thing. Ivan outright rejects the offer. He flat out refuses to be the architect of any utopia built on the tears of an innocent child.
And just to make sure we don't brush this off as some neat little thought experiment, Ivan brings up real, horrific historical anecdotes. He talks about invading soldiers turning the torture of a baby into this joyful, artistic game, literally laughing as they pulled the trigger. It's hard to even think about, but Dostoevsky uses this jarring reality of human evil to highlight something crucial. Human cruelty completely defies any rational equation. There is just no way to mathematically justify or balance out that level of suffering with some promised future utopia.
Which brilliantly brings us to Ivan's final iconic stance. He says, "It's not worth the tears of that one tortured child. I most respectfully return him the ticket." Ivan is completely rejecting what he calls Euclidean logic, the straightforward mathematical calculation that says ultimate harmony is somehow worth the cost of unatoned suffering. Purely out of a deep, agonizing love for humanity, he just refuses the entrance ticket to that paradise.
To really grasp what's going on here, we actually have to look at the Russian language itself, because it has two totally different words for truth. First, you have istina. Now, istina is your epistemic, rational, Euclidean truth. It's the 2 + 2 = 4 kind of truth, right? But then there's pravda. Pravda is a higher moral truth. It's centered on justice, on your worldview, on ultimate meaning. So Dostoevsky and Avon are showing us that even if mathematical istina proves that a utopia is entirely possible, they still reject it in favor of the higher moral pravda. Dostoevsky is essentially saying, look, I would rather stand with Christ and human suffering than side with sterile mathematical logic.
But this brings us to a terrifying crossroads in Section 4, the burden of freedom.
So, if we reject the programmed control of that crystal palace, we're left with absolute freedom. And to see the extremes of that burden, we look at another famous character, Raskolnikov from Crime and Punishment. He develops this genuinely chilling theory. Basically, he believes humanity is divided into two groups, ordinary people who have to obey the law, and extraordinary people who have a private, inherent right to just step right over the law and commit crimes if it serves some grander purpose. This is exactly the disastrous consequence of unchecked autonomy. I mean, Raskolnikov literally murders a pawnbroker for no other reason than to prove to himself that he has the supreme will to act completely free from any moral restraint.
Dostoevsky uses this whole scenario to draw a really sharp line between two very different types of freedom. On one side, we have what we can call freedom from. That's Raskolnikov's belief in rule-breaking autonomy and just escaping authority. And where does it lead? It leads straight to isolation, crushing guilt, and total psychological collapse. On the flip side, we have freedom too, which is represented by the character Sonia. This actually aligns perfectly with the Thomistic Aristotelian tradition. It argues that true freedom actually requires moral restraint. It's the freedom to know what is good and actively choose it. Unrestrained egoism, that isn't freedom at all. It's honestly just a different kind of prison.
And this leads us to the absolute climax of Dostoevsky's terror, which is so beautifully captured in the parable of the Grand Inquisitor. The Inquisitor reveals this incredibly dark secret. True freedom is actually an agonizing burden. Because freedom inherently allows for the possibility of great evil, and because it demands immense personal responsibility, it's terrifying. It's so terrifying, in fact, that humanity is constantly tempted to just hand over its free will to authority figures or to systems. We are eager to trade away our freedom if it means we get guaranteed comfort and security in return.
So, how do all these psychological threads tie together? Let's look at Section 5, Dostoevsky's terrifying challenge. He writes, and I quote, "Man only exists for the purpose of proving to himself every minute that he is free." That right there, that is the beating heart of Dostoevsky's philosophy. Our essence isn't reason. It certainly isn't scientific progress. Our true essence is this unstoppable and sometimes incredibly tragic drive to exercise our free will, even if it ends up hurting us.
Let's quickly summarize the key takeaways of this explainer and connect these 19th century insights directly to our modern world. First off, technological utopianism, our modern algorithmic crystal palace. It actually enslaves us by treating us as nothing more than predictable data points. Second, pure logic is always going to fail human nature. We will literally rebel against it just to prove we are alive. Third, true freedom inherently requires the capacity for evil and suffering. You simply cannot have one without risking the other. And finally, to actually survive all of this, we can't just seek freedom from the rules. We have to actively embrace the heavy moral responsibility of freedom to do good.
Which leaves us with this final, incredibly provocative thought. In an age of endless algorithms designed to predict your every move, optimize your life, and keep you perfectly comfortable, what are you going to choose? Will you embrace the agonizing burden of true freedom, or will you quietly hand over your ticket for the soothing, predictable comfort of the modern Crystal Palace? Think carefully about your answer.